The wind tore through the thin canvas of the medical tent, whining like a trapped animal. Elara shivered. She pressed her bleeding, frost-bitten fingers against the heavy stone pestle, grinding the last of the dried winter roots. The skin around her knuckles was split and raw, leaving faint copper smears on the gray stone. Outside, the camp was suffocating under the frost. Wet, rattling coughs echoed from the neighboring tents. Her pack was starving, but Silas poured their remaining supplies into his hunters and his elite guard, leaving the rest to freeze. Elara's stomach cramped. She had given her meager ration of stale bread to a sick pup that morning. A stupid, lethal decision. But she couldn't turn off the frantic compulsion to heal. She scraped the powdered root into a chipped bowl. It smelled of dirt and ash. It wouldn't cure the camp's sickness, only numb the pain for a few hours. She knew the chemical makeup of every poisonous plant in the forest. She could stop Silas's heart with a single drop of distilled nightshade. But the paralyzing terror of actually crossing that line kept her hands tied to the mortar. A horn blasted. Men began shouting near the southern gates. Moving on instinct, Elara grabbed a ragged shawl, wrapped it tight and pushed out into the freezing white. The entire encampment had flooded out of their tents. Dozens of Silas's hunters marched through the iron gates, dragging something that made a heavy, clashing sound against the frozen earth. They were out of breath, faces flushed with frantic triumph. It was a man. He was stripped bare from the waist up despite the lethal cold. Deep gashes across his chest leaked dark blood into the snow. Iron shackles bound his wrists and throat, secured by chains so heavy it took 4 hunters to pull him forward. Torin, the Shadow Pack leader. Even dragging on his knees, he radiated danger. He kept his head low, suppressing his wolf, forcing his body into lockdown to conserve heat. The main cabin doors swung open and Silas stepped out. He wore layers of pristine white wolf fur, smelling sharply of sweet perfumed oils that completely masked his natural scent. "Look at the legendary monster," Silas projected. "Brought to his knees in my snow." Torin didn't look up. He just breathed. "Strip him of his pride," Silas mocked, keeping a careful distance from the chained man's reach. "Let the cold seep into his bones." Silas scanned the crowd and stopped. He pointed a clean finger directly at Elara. "Healer." The crowd parted, stepping away from Elara like she carried the plague. "Bring him to the medical tent," Silas ordered. 2 elite guards hauled Torin upward. The wet sound of torn flesh made Elara flinch as they dragged the bleeding king toward her. Silas walked over, his cloying perfume making her want to gag. "The solstice is in exactly 1 week," Silas murmured, his breath hot on her freezing cheek. "The territory will gather here to watch him die on the execution block. It must be slow." Elara stared at the blood dripping from Torin's chains. "He's losing too much blood. The iron is poisoning his wounds. He won't last the night." Silas smiled thinly. "Then you better get to work. Keep him breathing. If his heart stops beating before I am ready to cut it out." He gripped her bruised chin, digging his manicured nails into her skin. "Yours will follow." Elara swallowed hard and nodded. Silas wiped his hand on his cloak and snapped at the guards. They shoved Torin through the flaps of the medical tent. The chains slammed against the dirt, followed by the thud of his body. The guards left. If he died, she died. Trembling, Elara stepped into the dark. The air inside the tent was thick, reeking of copper blood, sweat, and rotting frostbite. Elara fumbled for the wooden table in the corner and struck a flint. The tiny orange flame pushed back the blackness, revealing Torin lying on his side in the dirt. The shackles binding his wrists and neck were plated in silver, designed to burn shifter flesh. Deep, seeping burns hissed where the metal met his skin. His breathing was dangerously shallow, rattling deep in his chest. She grabbed the bowl of crushed roots, poured a splash of icy sterile water over the dust, and mixed it with her thumb. She dropped to her knees beside him. The heat radiating off his feverish body was shocking. A furnace fighting a losing battle against the ice. He was the enemy. But Silas's threat hung over her head. She scooped a thick clump of the caustic herbal paste and pressed it directly into the torn flesh of his shoulder to draw out the silver poisoning. Torin didn't flinch. Instead, a low, guttural rumble vibrated through the dirt beneath her knees, rattling the glass vials on her table. Elara snatched her hand back. Torin's eyes snapped open. They were glowing gold, burning through the dim candlelight with terrifying focus. He didn't look at his chains or the blood pooling in the dirt. He looked directly at her. Elara couldn't breathe. She waited for him to snap his jaws at her throat. He didn't strike. Instead, his chest expanded. He drew a slow, deliberate breath. He was scenting her. Beneath the overwhelming stench of raw meat and sharp herbs, his wolf was isolating her. A sudden heat flared in Elara's chest. Her pulse roared. Her hands, numb with frost, burned with a desperate need to reach out and soothe the lines of agony around his jaw. She dug her fingernails into her palms to stop herself. Torin exhaled. The feral tension in his shoulders softened into an unwavering fixation. Crushed pine needles. His voice was a gravelly rumble, rough as broken glass. And the storm. Elara's breath hitched. She stared at him, stripped bare by a single, quiet observation. Elara scrambled backward until her spine hit the work table. "Don't speak," she whispered. "Don't move." Torin ignored her. Slowly he shifted his weight. The silver chains groaned, biting deeper into his neck, but he pushed himself up onto one elbow. His gaze drifted from her face down to her bruised knuckles, the thin shawl covering her collarbones and the hollows of her cheeks. "You're freezing," he said, his voice entirely devoid of malice. "And you're starving." "I'm fine," Elara snapped, pulling her shawl tighter. "I'm the pack healer." You're a slave." Elara's jaw snapped shut. A defensive flush burned the back of her neck. "Your alpha parades his power in furs," Torin continued, "while the one who heals his people grinds roots until her fingers bleed. They chain me with silver. But they chain you with fear, little healer." A hot tear broke free, tracking down her freezing cheek. The walls she had built to survive Silas's cruelty fractured under the quiet honesty of a chained monster. The crunch of heavy boots interrupted them. Someone was marching toward the tent. Well, Beta Garrick's cruel voice drifted through the canvas. "Let's see what the little healer is doing with the king." The canvas flap was ripped aside, bringing a blinding swirl of snow and the sour stench of stale sweat. Elara threw herself over her work table, frantically sweeping her rare medicinal herbs into a hidden pouch. If he saw them, he'd confiscate them for the guards. Beta Garrick ducked his massive frame inside. Wrapped in thick furs, he ignored Elara entirely, fixing his dark eyes on the Shadow King. "Look at this," Garrick sneered. "The great and terrible Torin, reduced to a shivering dog in the dirt." Torin didn't move. He didn't make a sound. Only his gold eyes tracked Garrick's movements. Garrick stepped closer and kicked the heavy silver chains. The metal clanged sharply. "You killed my brother at the river border," Garrick muttered. "The solstice is too far away. I think I'll take a piece of you tonight." Elara pressed her spine against the wood. "My alpha wants him alive. If you touch him, Silas will have your head." Garrick turned his thick neck. A slow, ugly smile stretched across his scarred face. As he stepped toward her, his boot deliberately caught the edge of Elara's only basin of sterile water. The clay bowl shattered. The precious water soaked into the filthy dirt. Hours of melting clean snow over a pathetic fire, wasted in a second. Elara gripped the table, swallowing a scream of rage. Garrick closed the distance, trapping her against the table. The smell of sour wine and unwashed flesh rolled off his coat. "Silas wants the monster alive," Garrick murmured, leaning down until his breath brushed her cheek. He said nothing about keeping the little healer untouched. He reached out with a filthy hand to grab a lock of her hair. "Nobody cares about you, Elara. You freeze in this tent. You starve. If you scream right now, who in this pathetic camp is going to come save you?" A deafening, metallic shriek ripped through the tent. Torin lunged. The heavy silver chains snapped taut, biting so deeply into his flesh that hot blood sprayed across the dirt. He couldn't reach Garrick, but the explosive force of his movement shook the ground. A roar tore from Torin's chest, so vibrating with lethal intent that Garrick stumbled backward in panic. "Touch her again," Torin snarled, "and I'll tear your arms from their sockets." Garrick drew his hunting knife, his hand trembling. But Torin was securely pinned. The silver was holding. Garrick let out a shaky laugh and turned his predatory attention back to Elara. "He can't save you," Garrick sneered. Garrick was right. No one was coming. If she submitted, she would die in this tent. Elara lowered her eyes, forcing her body to tremble, playing the perfect terrified victim. "Please," she whimpered, reaching behind her back. I can offer you something. To warm you against the cold." She pulled a steaming clay cup from the back of the table. "A specialized brew of dark tea. Drink this. Then, do what you want." Garrick snatched the hot cup from her hands. Blinded by the arrogance of a man who believed he held absolute power, he tipped his head back and drank the dark liquid in 3 massive gulps. He wiped his mouth with his sleeve, grinning. Now. He stopped. The hunting knife slipped from his fingers and hit the dirt. Garrick's eyes blew wide with terror. A sickening, wet gurgle slipped past his lips. The specialized neurotoxin, distilled from highly concentrated wolfsbane spores, hit his bloodstream like a sledgehammer. His knees buckled and his massive body crashed face-first into the freezing dirt right at Elara's feet. His muscles locked in rigid, paralyzing spasms. Only his eyes moved, darting wildly, begging for mercy. Elara stood perfectly still. The trembling in her hands evaporated, replaced by an intoxicating rush of pure control. She looked down at the paralyzed enforcer. "I warned you about Silas," she whispered. "I never warned you about me." She lifted her gaze. Torin had stopped struggling. He lay perfectly still in the dirt, ignoring his bleeding wounds. His gold eyes were locked onto her, devoid of horror or judgment. He looked at her with undeniable, predatory respect. The dark thrill of power vanished, replaced by the terrifying reality of a dead man on her floor. Moving on instinct, Elara grabbed the thick collar of his fur coat. He was dead weight. She dragged him backward, his iron-tipped boots carving deep trenches into the dirt. She pushed through the rear flap into the biting wind, hauling him into the deepest snowbank behind her supplies. Her muscles screamed. She frantically kicked heavy piles of white snow over his unmoving form until the frost completely swallowed him. She stood over the makeshift grave, lungs burning. A distant call cut through the howling wind. "Garrick. The patrol guard is coming. Garrick, the perimeter is set." Panic spiked in her chest. He had to get back inside. Elara lunged back through the canvas flaps and fell to her knees in the dark tent. The patrol was coming. Shifters could track a strange scent from a mile away, and the bitter metallic tang of wolfsbane spores was lingering in the air. "The pine needles," Torin commanded softly, his golden eyes glowing. "Burn them. The smoke will mask the toxin." Elara scrambled to the wooden table, grabbed a handful of dried pine needles from a leather pouch, and tossed them into the tiny iron brazier. They caught fire instantly, releasing a thick, choking cloud of sharp, earthy smoke. Footsteps crunched outside. The patrol guard paused right at the canvas entrance. Elara held her breath. The heavy scent of burning pine filled the small space, burying the poison. The footsteps finally moved away, fading into the wind. Elara let out a ragged breath. She turned to look at the bleeding Shadow King in the dirt. The enemy she was supposed to fear had just actively hidden her treason. A deep gratitude swelled in her chest, permanently shattering the last remnants of her loyalty to her pack. Elara knelt back down beside Torin. She reached for a small, dark glass vial hidden beneath her work table, a highly corrosive, acidic compound she used for burning away dead flesh. "I'm going to get you out of those chains," she whispered, uncorking the glass. The sharp smell of acid stung her eyes. "It's pure silver," Torin rumbled. "It won't break easily. Then we cheat." She carefully painted the thick paste directly onto the internal locking mechanisms of his shackles. The metal hissed, a tiny ribbon of gray smoke curling into the air. It was a slow, agonizingly delicate process, but Torin didn't flinch. Suddenly, a deafening horn blasted across the camp. Silas's magically magnified voice echoed through the screaming wind. "The execution is moved. Tomorrow at dawn, the Shadow King dies." Elara froze, the vial shaking in her bruised hands. Tomorrow. The acid needed 3 full days to eat through the silver. If he tried to break the chains at dawn, they would hold. They were out of time. Elara stared at the tiny ribbons of gray smoke rising from the silver shackles. The acid was working, but painfully slow. By dawn, the iron would only be pitted. If Torin tried to break the chains in the morning, the unbroken metal would rip his arms out. Panic seized her throat. "Leave the camp," Torin said, his voice entirely calm. Take your medical supplies and run into the trees. My pack will find you. They'll keep you safe. Elara shook her head. I'll freeze to death before I make it a mile, she whispered, her hands flying over her work table, knocking over empty clay cups. Besides, if I leave now, Silas will execute you and parade your head on a pike. She began grabbing dark glass vials, furiously shoving dried, toxic leaves into her leather mortar. If the chains wouldn't break, she had to ensure the men holding the weapons couldn't strike. What are you doing? Torin asked. Leveling the field, she replied, grinding the pestle down with desperate strength. Silas relies on his 12 elite guards. They eat from a separate kitchen. A special solstice ration to celebrate the execution. Elara poured a dark oily liquid into the crushed leaves. It smelled like burnt sugar and rotting earth. She looked at Torin. The terror in her chest was eclipsed by a burning, tunnel vision focus. She was preparing to dismantle the entire military structure of her own pack. I'll be right back, she whispered, slipping through the flaps into the pitch-black night. The winter wind whipped against Elara's thin shawl, biting her exposed skin. She moved like a ghost through the sleeping encampment. Years of sneaking around to avoid Silas's cruelty had inadvertently trained her for this. She crept around the back of the mess hall kitchens. A dim orange light flickered through the frosted window. Inside, the massive iron pot of morning stew was already bubbling over the low coals. She carefully lifted the heavy wooden latch on the back door. It creaked. Heavy, dragging footsteps echoed from the front of the mess hall. The night watchman. Elara slipped into the deep shadows beneath the prep tables. Her heart slammed against her ribs. The watchman walked past the boiling pot, pausing to warm his hands over the coals. The scent of cheap tobacco and stale sweat filled the kitchen. After an agonizing minute, he grunted and shuffled back out the front door. Elara scrambled out from under the table and uncorked the dark glass vial. Her hands shook. If she used too much, the stew would turn bitter and the guards would refuse it. If she used too little, they'd only get drowsy. She poured exactly 5 drops of the thick oily poison directly into the boiling meat. It dissolved instantly. No smell. No color. She turned and fled back into the darkness. As she sprinted through the deep snow, the eastern sky began to bleed a pale gray. Elara practically fell through the flaps of the medical tent. She collapsed to her knees in the dirt, her muscles trembling from the adrenaline crash. Her lips were bruised blue, and her freezing fingers were locked into tight claws. She crawled blindly across the dark space until her knees bumped into Torin's leg. The Shadow King shifted, the silver chains clanging against the earth. Unable to use his arms, he leaned his massive upper body down, ignoring the silver biting into his neck, and pressed his heavy chest directly against her shivering shoulder. Elara gasped at the sudden blast of heat. It was like resting against a living furnace. "Give me your hands," Torin murmured. Elara weakly lifted her blistered fingers. Torin leaned his heavy head down, pressing his warm jaw and the side of his neck against her hands. He trapped her freezing fingers firmly against his burning skin, shielding her from the cold. "You came back," he whispered, the gentle rumble of his chest pressing into her back. "I told you I would," she murmured. The intoxicating scent of crushed pine and dark earth washed over her. For the first time in her life she felt safe. "When the sun rises," Torin promised, his low voice carrying an absolute certainty, "I will burn this camp to the ground for what they did to you." The canvas tent flaps were ripped open. Harsh dawn light flooded the tent. 3 massive elite guards stood in the entrance, their steel broadswords drawn. "It's time," the lead guard barked. "Bring the beast to the execution block." The guards lunged into the tent, grabbed the silver chains binding Torin's neck and yanked backward. Torin was hauled up, his massive frame dragging against the dirt. He didn't fight them. He kept his gold eyes locked on Elara, his jaw tight. "Get out," a guard barked, shoving Elara by the shoulder. She stumbled through the canvas flaps into the blinding morning light. The entire encampment was waiting. Hundreds of starving, freezing pack members stood in a silent circle around the center courtyard. Elara was shoved into the front row. She frantically scanned the faces of the 12 elite guards forming a tight ring around the execution block. She looked for any sign of weakness, a tremor in their hands, a pale flush, a glazed look. Nothing. They stood tall, gripping their steel spears with unshaken strength. The poison wasn't working. Nauseating anxiety twisted Elara's insides. She had measured the dosage perfectly. Why weren't they falling? The guards shoved Torin to the center of the courtyard. He dropped heavily to his knees in the deep snow. Elara pressed her freezing hands over her mouth to muffle a sob. She was forced to stand in the crowd, completely powerless, while the Shadow King was marched to the slaughter. Silas stepped out of his main cabin, draped in immaculate white furs, savoring every step of his unearned victory. "Bind him to the ice," Silas shouted. The guards drove massive iron stakes deep into the frozen earth. They yanked Torin's silver chains, locking the heavy links directly into the stakes. Torin was pinned. Elara stopped breathing. This was the moment. He had to break them now. Torin let out a low, earth-rattling snarl. His massive shoulders bunched. He threw his entire weight against the chains. The metal groaned. Elara waited for the deafening snap, for the chemically weakened silver to shatter. The metal held fast. Torin strained harder, a feral roar ripping from his chest. The silver bit so deeply into his flesh that fresh blood sprayed across the snow. The stakes shifted slightly in the ice, but the links themselves didn't break. The acid hadn't eaten deep enough. A crushing despair slammed into Elara. She dropped to her knees in the snow, her chest heaving with dry, panicked sobs. Silas threw his head back and laughed, a cruel, thin sound cutting through the wind. He reached toward his belt. The metallic scrape of a massive silver-coated broadsword sliding from its sheath echoed across the silent camp. "Look at your king," Silas screamed to the frozen crowd. He paced in a slow circle around Torin, holding the massive broadsword high, keeping well out of the chained beast's reach. "The shadow packs whisper that he's a god," Silas mocked. "They say he cannot be broken. But look at him. Bleeding. Trapped. Pathetic. He is nothing but a wild dog, and today I put him down." The heavy scent of his perfumed oils drifted across the courtyard. Elara stared at the coward parading in the snow. Then she looked at Torin. The Shadow King was bleeding out, his flesh burning from the silver, but he didn't cower. He kept his glowing golden eyes locked onto her. Something deep inside Elara snapped. The terrified, subservient little healer died in the snow. She felt for the small, sharp skinning knife hidden inside her thin boots. It wouldn't pierce a guard's armor, but it would reach Silas's throat. Elara's muscles coiled. She planted her boots into the ice, preparing to launch herself forward. Silas stepped directly in front of Torin. "Let this be a warning to all who defy me," Silas roared. He raised the heavy silver broadsword high above his head with both hands. Elara inhaled a sharp, freezing breath. Silas swung the blade down. Elara lunged. A sharp, ringing clatter echoed across the courtyard. It wasn't the sound of a blade biting into flesh. It was the blunt sound of steel hitting solid ice. The lead elite guard, standing directly behind Silas, suddenly dropped his massive spear. Elara stopped dead in her tracks. The guard's knees buckled. He didn't cry out. He simply collapsed forward like a felled tree, his face smashing brutally into the deep snow. The poison. Elara's breath caught in her throat. The slow-burning metabolism of the shifter elites had finally processed the morning stew. A second guard dropped. Then a third. They toppled like heavy stone statues. The untraceable neurotoxin hit their bloodstreams in perfect synchronization. Within 5 seconds, all 12 elite guards crashed into the freezing dirt. They lay completely paralyzed, their muscles locked, trapped inside their own bodies. A scalding rush of adrenaline flooded Elara's veins. The suffocating despair shattered. She had done it. Her science was flawless. The pack's military structure had just been neutralized. Silas froze, the massive silver broadsword still suspended above his head. He stared at the ring of fallen soldiers. His pale eyes darted wildly. "Get up!" Silas shrieked, his voice cracking. "Get up! What is wrong with you?" Nobody moved. The entire encampment stood frozen in terrified shock. Elara didn't look at the screaming alpha. She looked directly at Torin. The Shadow King slowly lifted his heavy head. His golden eyes flashed with a brilliant, predatory fire. He knew exactly what she had done. Silas swung wildly around, his manicured hands trembling so hard he could barely hold the sword. "Guards!" Silas screamed at the terrified crowd, stepping backward in sheer panic. Kill the beast. Kill him now. Not a single pack member moved. They watched their untouchable alpha unravel in the snow. A low, terrible sound began to build in the center of the courtyard, the sickening high-pitched crunch of bending metal. Torin flexed his massive wrists. He dug his boots deep into the frozen earth. His muscles bunched, straining with explosive power. The acid hadn't broken the chains on its own, but it had compromised the internal mechanisms just enough. The chemically weakened silver shattered. Sounded like a massive pane of glass exploding. Shrapnel of broken silver and heavy iron links shot blindly across the ice. The deafening crash echoed off the surrounding pine trees. Torin was free. Elara gasped, a massive cathartic hit of dopamine surging through her system. The terrifying wait was over. She had unleashed the apex predator, and the reckoning had arrived. Silas dropped the heavy broadsword. It hit the snow with a dull thud. No. Silas whimpered, stumbling backward, his pristine white furs slipping off his shoulders. Wait. Torin didn't wait. The sickening crunch of heavy bones snapping and reforming filled the freezing air. Torin's massive human frame exploded forward, expanding, twisting, and darkening until a monstrous, smoke-black wolf landed heavily in the snow. The beast stood taller than a warhorse, its thick fur bristling in the wind, its jaws dripping with saliva and blood. The wolf didn't growl. It simply locked its burning gold eyes onto the cowardly alpha, coiling its massive hind legs for the final strike. The black wolf lunged. It hit Silas with the unstoppable force of a falling mountain. Silas didn't even have time to scream. The beast's massive jaws clamped directly over the alpha's neck. A wet tear ripped through the freezing air. Bright, steaming blood painted an arc across the white snow. Silas's lifeless body crumpled to the ice, instantly swallowed by the heavy winter drifts. The tyrant was dead. The agonizing reign of terror that had choked the pack for years was extinguished in a single heartbeat. Elara stood perfectly still. The suffocating weight that had crushed her lungs for her entire life evaporated, leaving behind a staggering rush of pure relief. The massive black wolf slowly turned. Dark crimson dripped steadily from its powerful muzzle, melting small holes into the ice. The beast stared out at the terrified encampment. Hundreds of pack members fell straight to their knees, pressing their faces into the dirt, entirely submitting to the overwhelming aura of death. The wolf didn't care about them. Its glowing golden eyes snapped through the crowd until they locked onto Elara. The sickening crunch of bones rearranging echoed across the courtyard as the monstrous wolf violently shrank, the black fur melting away as Torin shifted back into his human form. He stood up to his full, towering height in the center of the carnage, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. He was coated in his enemy's blood, the dark red stark against his scarred skin. The broken silver chains still dangled heavily from his wrists, chiming a dark rhythm in the wind. The entire pack trembled, waiting for the slaughter to continue. Torin ignored them. He stepped over Silas's ruined body and began to walk. His heavy bare feet crunched steadily through the blood-stained snow, marching in a perfectly straight line directly toward Elara. The crowd frantically scrambled backward, parting to give the Shadow King a wide, terrified berth. Elara held her ground. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs, but it wasn't fueled by fear. It was a massive wave of validation. The warlord who had just effortlessly ripped an alpha to shreds was looking at her with infinite devotion. He stopped right in front of her. The intoxicating scent of crushed pine, ozone, and fresh blood washed over her, and she could feel the impossible furnace-like heat radiating from his skin. Torin didn't reach for her. He didn't issue a command. Instead, the undisputed Shadow King dropped heavily to one knee in the blood-stained snow. A collective, terrified gasp rippled through the frozen encampment. The ultimate predator was lowering his massive head, offering his throat to the lowest-ranking ragged little healer in the pack. "The blood feud is dead," Torin rumbled. His deep voice echoed across the silent courtyard, vibrating with unquestionable authority. "This territory is claimed," he continued, lifting his head. His gold eyes burned into hers, stripping away the last remaining shards of her doubt. "And the healer is mine." He held his massive blood-soaked hand suspended in the freezing air between them. "She is my fated mate," Torin declared, his voice carrying straight to the edges of the frozen trees. and the undisputed queen of the untamed wild. Tears of blinding triumph spilled down Elara's cheeks. The terrified girl was gone forever. She was the architect of this downfall. She had paralyzed the guards, burned the silver, and unleashed the king. Elara stepped forward, leaving the frightened crowd behind her. She reached out and firmly grasped Torin's massive bloody hand. A roaring warmth shot up her arm. She squeezed his hand, accepting his heat, his power, and finally, unapologetically, accepting her own.